We're in Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through 43. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And we're going to look at how Jesus is greater. When it says he's greater, like the song. It's having to do with Jesus being greater. Last week we looked at the Great Commission of Mark chapter 16, 15 at the end of the book. But we're going back to where we were in our study of the book. In Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through 43. Where Jesus is doing a series of miracles and a variety of different things. And today, he's going to do an extreme miracle, raising someone from the dead. And not only that, but a child. In addition to that, he's going to do a miraculous physical healing of a woman. And then when we look at those things, I want us to be thinking about a few different truths, and that is that Jesus gives mercy to us. You can write these down. Jesus gives mercy to the meek, found in verses 21 through 24, okay? Jesus gives mercy to the meek. Second, Jesus gives power to the powerless, verses 25 through 34. And third, Jesus gives hope to the hopeless, verses 35 through 43, okay? And I want us to be thinking about one central idea, and that is trusting the Lord. When Mark is trying to get us to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, chapter 1, verse 1, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Anointed One of Israel, when he's trying to prove that Jesus is those things, he uses a lot of action that we've talked about. He uses a lot of immediately, a lot of rushing into things, very little teaching. You know, he's got the parable of soils and the Olivet Discourse, but other than those two places, very little teaching. Most of it is what Jesus did. And what Mark's trying to do is he's trying to give us a modern man's version of how to know that Jesus is who he says he is. And that is, he's doing miracle after miracle after miracle. He's doing amazing things. And we saw that he calmed the storm, right? And that he's healed other people, such as the man who was lowered down from the roof. And today, as we look at it, we're going to see that we can trust in Jesus because he's that kind of guy. Now, before we get started, I want you to think about something else that's something that you find in the book of Mark. It's a literary technique, okay? You need to know this. Mark often does what's called the sandwich technique, okay? How many of you like to build a good sandwich? I love a Dagwood, you know? You got a piece of sourdough, and then you put a piece of beef, a piece of ham, right? A little lettuce, a little bologna, a little bit lettuce, maybe a little bit more bologna, a little bit more ham, a little bit more beef, maybe a hamburger. You know, you just stack it up, man. You know, and you get yourself a good Dagwood. But the sandwich technique is there's a piece of bread, there's something in between, and then another piece of bread, and that makes a sandwich. In the text before us today, it's going to start off with a ruler of the synagogue and the dying of his daughter. His name is Jairus. And so that's the first piece of bread. And then right in the middle of the story, Mark's going to push in Peter's account of what happened there, which is where in the middle of going to heal her, in the middle of that, he also does another miracle for somebody else, this woman, this unknown woman. And then at the end, it comes back to Jairus. So you're going to see Jairus, this unknown woman healed of her issue of blood, and then Jairus again. It's called the sandwich technique, and you'll see that often throughout Mark, okay? But when we look at this, I was thinking about problems. If I said, how many of us have problems this morning? Probably, if we're honest, all of us would have to raise our hands, right? We live in a broken world. We live in a sin-filled world. And guess who's most broken of all? Me. I'm most broken of all because I'm the guy who looks in the mirror and I know my brokenness more than your brokenness and our hurting and the like. And we have problems because of those things. And I was thinking about what should we do with these problems, right? Because that's basically what Jairus is doing. His daughter's dying. What do we do with that problem? The woman with the issue of blood, she has this serious problem for 12 years, both of them. What does she do with it? They bring their problems to Jesus. And this is what Chuck Swindoll offers in Wise Counsel. He says, every problem is an opportunity to prove, underline that, God's power. Every problem is an opportunity to prove God's power. Every day we encounter countless golden opportunities to prove God, brilliantly disguised as insurmountable problems. Don't you like that? That insurmountable problems for us are just nothing for Jesus. The Jesus that walks on water, the Jesus that calmed the storm, the Jesus that raises people from the dead, he can handle these things, he can handle ours too. So we ask ourselves, I want to learn more about what God does with my problems. What do I need to do to see what God can do with my problems, right? Well, as we look at Jairus, you're going to see what he does. He's a man who was walking away from Jesus Christ, but then turns around and walks towards Jesus Christ because of a desperate need. And then the woman in blood is a woman who's been pursuing lots of people to heal her, but never finds a solution. All of life and earth's solutions from the best people come up short, but Jesus meets that need. So as we walk through the text of Mark 5:21 through 43, I want you to think about those three amazing truths that I gave you. First of all, Jesus gives mercy to the meek, right? Verse 21. I'll give you a little bit of the setting. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Okay, remember he went from this side of Israel, across the Sea of Galilee, to the Decapolis side, 10 cities, which are Roman. Herod ran those, and he was over there, the Gerasenes. And remember, he kicked Legion, the demons, out of the demoniac who was running around the tombs and cutting himself and living among the graves, and he cast him into swine. And so now that he's done the miracles over there, they didn't like that. If you remember the text there, it said that the people were afraid of him and they asked Jesus to leave. So because they reject Jesus, he no longer does miracles there, and he gets back in the boat and he travels back over to the other side. So the Lord left Galilee, and now he's coming back to Galilee, to the northwest side of the lake, probably near Capernaum. Okay? And so while he's there, it says, verse 22, then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she may be healed and live. Now think about that. Anybody who's here been a grandparent or a parent or close to children, is there anything worse than the idea of losing one of your own? There's nothing worse. There's nothing worse than that. Maybe losing a spouse is close, but losing a child. So what we see is we see Jairus, the synagogue ruler. What this basically means when it says synagogue ruler is most scholars believe that he was the leader of the synagogue. He was the religious leader. He was the head guy, the head dog. And what have we seen about him and his buddies, the Pharisees and Sadducees? How did they feel about Jesus? They didn't like this guy very much at all. They didn't like him any. Right? We've been looking at that every single week. And yet we see the religious leader of the synagogue. What does he do? Is he like the Pharisees that come out and they go after Jesus? Is he like the Sadducees who are trying to undercut Jesus with a plot to kill him? What does he do? Because of his desperation over his daughter, he flips a 180. And he turns from himself and his own religion, his own rules, and he turns to Jesus, right? His meekness receives Jesus' mercy, as we go on and see. He's kind of like the president of the board of elders that managed that synagogue. And they didn't have a high opinion of Jesus, but because of his rabid need of what his daughter needed, he turns to Jesus. Now, those guys are pretty prejudiced, right, against Jesus. Prejudice is you make a judgment beforehand. And they didn't like him. But when we become desperate is when we're most likely to listen to the Lord, isn't it? When we become desperate is when we're most likely to receive from the Lord. And so Jairus, he falls at Jesus' feet. He pleads him earnestly, verse 23, my little daughter's dying. Come put your hands on her so that she may be healed and live. So verse 24 says what? Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed and pressed around him, right? Now this is where the sandwich turns. It introduces us to Jairus. And he pleads for the Lord Jesus. Instead of being like the other religious leaders and having a one-up attitude, he takes a one-down attitude. And Jesus, who's been hard fast against the Pharisees, has mercy on him because the man humbles himself. He has mercy upon him and he goes with him. And then the story's going to change over to the next person on the way, the woman with blood. But before we leave, I want you to think about a couple things. Why does the Lord change his behavior towards one of these horrible religious leaders? Just think about it. A couple things. First, he was desperate, right? He fell at Jesus' feet. He humbles himself. The book of James says, he who humbles himself will be exalted. He who exalts himself will be humbled. That is repeated out of the Old Testament. That's repeated in the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus himself. And this man, this Jairus guy, he humbles himself and he's desperate for Jesus Christ. Look at the great humility that he puts himself through. And I want you to think just a little bit about that. When we come to Jesus and trust, it takes self-risk taking. We have to abandon ourselves and what we want, and we need to pursue Jesus Christ. And if we don't do that, we can't reach him. We can't meet him because we have to play on his playing field, not on our own playing field. And so it's important that we come to him with a sense of desperation, a sense of humility, right? It reminds me of a Russian soccer player back in the 90s. He was a short-time celebrity. His name was Valentine, and his parents were believers when the Soviet Union opened up after the fall of Russia in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and all that. And suddenly the Navigators and Camps Crusade for Christ and the Southern Baptists, a bunch of people rushed missionaries into Russia. And this 70-year atheistic, communistic country was quickly being Christianized. People were coming to Christ in droves. And the Jesus movie was a big part of that. So when Chris Weldon and Christian Motorcyclists of America used the Jesus movie, that's a proven methodology for evangelism that's reached over 1 billion people. So all these people are coming to Christ, and his parents, Valentine's parents, came to Christ. And they were putting the pressure on him to come to church, give your life to Christ, quit living in the spotlight. Well, what they didn't know was Valentine was not only this big-time soccer player making all this money, but he was crooked on the underbelly. And he was working with the organized mob of Russia. He so wanted to go against Christ, he would not humble himself, that he actually put out a hit to kill his parents and had them executed. Was that the end of the story? No. Because this is a true story where Valentine, as much as he tried to get away from Jesus Christ, as much as he fled from Jesus Christ pursued him. And on one day, according to his own account, a couple years later, he found himself so compelled to go into a church that in the middle of the sermon, he breaks into this Orthodox church, runs to the front, throws himself on the altar, and gives his life to God. Even though he had done this horrible deed, he finally found humility because God pursued him with his love. God was there with his love, and he found that his self-sufficiency was not enough. And Jairus figured out, my self-sufficiency is not enough. No matter how much money I have, no matter how much power I have, no matter what doctors I can access, it's not enough. I cannot get my daughter healed. And so he falls at the feet of Jesus. So he's desperate, he's humble. But he also believes that Jesus will make a difference. Come and put your hands on her, right, so that she will be healed and live, it says. He had heard the stories of Jesus' miracles. Quite possibly he'd seen some firsthand, and even though he wasn't willing to go along with it before, when it came to his own family, and he was in that desperate need, he was willing to do whatever it took, right? So just think for a second of how desperate you would be if your child was that sick, right? You would do anything. So verse 24 says, Jesus went with him. This is actually quite amazing that now one of these religious leaders like the Pharisees and Jesus are almost walking side by side, hand in hand, almost down the road to heal his daughter. And what it tells us is that no matter what we've done with Jesus in the past, no matter how we've put our face against him, no matter how much we've hardened our hearts, no matter what we do, if we come to Jesus humbly, he will hear us. He will accept us and he will love us. He takes all of us from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of different things that we come out of, and he cares about each and every one of us no matter what it is. That's the great thing that we see here. Now we flip the story over, right, to the woman, right? A large crowd had gathered and were pressed around, verse 24 said. And this is the second point. Jesus gives power to the powerless, right? Jesus gives power to the powerless. In verse 25, and a woman was there. Now, she's there, but it's unnamed in the text. Church tradition says that her name was Veronica and that she came from Caesar of Philippi. But guess what? Church tradition isn't fact. It's just a guess, right? Somebody believed that was her name. We really don't know who she is. There's this unnamed woman that's in the crowd that's pressing in on Jesus as he's going to Jairus' house to heal his daughter. And as he's there, here's this woman, and it says verse 25, she had physical problems. She was a woman there that had been subject to what? To bleeding for 12 years. She had some kind of feminine issue of bleeding that had caused her a lot, probably, most scholars think, a lot of pain, a lot of disconnection from the people around her, a variety of different things. So she had this physical issue that had been going on for 12 years, okay? 12 years. And then it says in verse 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, Yet instead of getting better, she'd gotten worse. Now, this is not a cack from the scriptures on doctors. God blesses some men and women with great healing arts. And it's a gift that God gives them, and doctors are a great gift to us. But in this particular time frame, they weren't as advanced as we were, and she'd spent all that she had to try to heal her bleeding disorder. And so a couple of things that she probably tried that you'd find in the Talmud is, one of those things that they did back then was they would say, you take a piece of corn and you put it in donkey dung and you carry it around in a white handkerchief for the next month, and that will heal you. That was actually a prescription. So she spent a lot of money on that. If you go to your doctor and he prescribes donkey dung, you might want to reconsider his advice. Okay? Another thing that they often did was they would say, you take the fish bones and you eat the bones of a fish, and then they had this whole weird thing that they did. How does that have anything to do with healing somebody? But in the superstitious time frame, the legitimate doctors of that day had probably tried all kinds of things, but it didn't help. She had been having this serious issue of bleeding for 12 years. She also had financial problems, right? Because she'd been under the care of many doctors, and she had spent all that she had. So not only is she physically broken, but she's financially broken. And along with that, she had emotional and social problems. Verse 26, right? In verse 26, it says that she'd spent all that she had, and instead of getting better, she got worse. And the reason it's a big deal is because back then, if you had a bleeding issue in that culture, you were considered unclean. No one was to touch a woman during that particular time of her cycle. And so that was part of the culture. And if there was a dead body, which Jesus is going to see in the young woman to come, Jairus' daughter, you weren't to touch that either. Death was unclean, blood was unclean, and so you were not to have anything to do with those bodies. And so just like a leper, this woman for the last 12 years probably, most scholars think, has been a social outcast. She's got a physical issue, she's got a financial issue, she's broke, and she's ostracized from her family, her friends, and her culture because of this bleeding disorder. So what do you see that connects her with Jairus' father? What do they both have in common? They're desperate, right? Jairus can do nothing. His daughter's dying. This woman has done all that she can, and she cannot cure her issue, and neither can somebody else around them, not even the best healers of the time. And they're desperate. Verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and she reached out and touched his cloak, because she thought within herself, if I touch his clothes, I will be healed. So I want you to think just a few things about this woman's faith. Because by doing that, she enacts her faith. Did she enact a great deal of faith? No, just a little bit. Something else that her and Jairus' father are going to share. They don't have to enact a lot of faith, but a little bit of faith will go a long ways, right? Jesus will meet you with whatever faith you give him, and he does that for both of them. So she believed that Jesus could do what others could not do. I'm sure she reasoned within herself, if I touch his robe, I'll be healed. And Jesus can do what the doctors have failed to do. And he can do it, therefore I believe it. She must have had some kind of internal thoughts like this that kind of drove her behavior. And then she acted upon her belief, right? She pursued Jesus. She found out where he was at, and she went there. And then she pressed into the crowd and pushing all these things. Remember, she's unclean, and people wouldn't like that if they knew her. And she's pressing through the group of people, and eventually she finds where she can reach out through these people pressing on them and touch Jesus' cloak. This woman is going to great means. And guess what happens? Verse 29. Immediately, remember, Mark likes that word, immediately. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Have you ever had one of those healing experiences? You have something wrong with your body, you go in for surgery, you're not sure how it's going to come out, but on the other side you go, whew, I'm sure glad that worked out. That physician fixed this issue. She was great, or he was great. And then within weeks, you feel remarkably better. And I've seen people, and I've been with people when they've had that. I remember my son fell out of a tree when he was 7. He was playing war. I love this. He's playing war. He's sniping at guys with his little airsoft gun. And he's pinning them down. He's winning on his side. He's getting these guys all nailed to the wall. And then they figured out what the sniper was. And then they all turn on him and start shooting at him. So being the gutsy little guy that he was, I love this. He was gutsy. He goes running down this pine tree, running down the limbs, of which one finally gave way. He wasn't nearly as big as he is now, little guy. gave way, and he fell out of that tree into a group of rocks, and he dislocated and broke his thumb and laid it back here on the back of his hand. The best part of that story is his mama tells me, he comes across the street and he says, Mom, I think I hurt my thumb. I think we ought to go to the hospital. So she calls me from work, and I meet her at the hospital. I go in there, and sure enough, the thing's laid over. And I'm thinking he's going to be screaming and yelling and all that. And he's like, Dad, I don't think that's quite right. I think we got to do something about that, right? But when the doctor said, this is really going to hurt Greg, so I'm going to give you some injections. So he gave him 4 or 5 injections of something like Novocaine or something that would numb it up. And he said, I'm going to have to pull it back and snap your joint back in. And with that break, that's really going to hurt. Well, that doctor let us sit there for about 40 minutes. I think he was a great guy. Love that guy. Because otherwise, it would have screamed him all the way, So he pulls that thing back and snap. And you could hear it, and Greg just went, oh, that feels better. Little 7-year-old. And that must have been what this woman felt like. She reached out and touched Jesus' cloak, and just like that, she felt better. God healed her of her bleeding issue. Her faith may have been weak, it may have been timid, perhaps even maybe a little bit superstitious, but it was yet faith, and God honored it. And so we see this woman coming to Jesus and getting her need met for her problem. And is she disappointed? No. Jesus does not disappoint us. When we put our trust in him, he meets us there and he takes care of us. This is what Wiersbe says. Not everybody has the same degree of faith, but Jesus responds to faith no matter how feeble it might be. When we believe at any level, he shares his power with us and something remarkable happens in our lives spiritually. Don't you think that's true? When we come before Jesus with whatever faith that we have, he meets us there. And he says, come. And when we come, he gives us what we need. We can trust a God like that. The same God that healed this woman with a bleeding disorder can heal us today. That's the same God that did it then is the same God today. And this woman now won't have to spend her money. She now will not be a social outcast. She now will not be emotionally in turmoil. And now she's physically whole because of her encounter with Jesus. But that's not where the story ends for her, right? He comes back around, verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. That doesn't mean he was caught off guard. It just Mark's recording what Peter said. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now we all know Jesus knew who that was. But the reason he's saying that is to put it out from the private level to the public level, okay? And then he says in verse 31, you see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around, verse 32, to see who had done it. Then the woman, verse 33, knowing what had happened to her, she came forward and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. Verse 34, he said to her, daughter, now isn't that a nice thing? Daughter. He doesn't say woman, he says daughter, a term of affection. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And the reason I'm pointing that out is I want you to see something. Jesus was not content for her to be healed in private. He wanted her to be public. He didn't ask her to give up and give a testimony like he sometimes asks people, go and tell what the Lord's done for you. But he did make her come forward by his questions. He caused her to come forward in the crowd and to expose who she was and that she'd been healed. And the reason for that is when people see a transformed life by Jesus Christ, they believe it can happen to them too. And Jesus is always trying to build faith. And this woman had some faith, and he wants to show that when we come to God, like Hebrews 11 says, we must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. That's what faith is all about. And this woman had a little bit of faith, the faith of mustard seed. And when she came to him, Jesus healed her, but he also wanted other people to see that her act publicly had done this thing for her, and that his power moves when we reach him. Now, she had fear, right? But God didn't treat her badly. Did Jesus put her down? Did he say, I can't believe you've done this? You didn't even come and ask for that? Did Jesus kind of kick her in the teeth, so to speak, verbally? No, that's not the God that we serve. Jesus lovingly, caringly nurtures her, and he says, my daughter, right? He loves her, and that's how Jesus is when we come to him. He wants us to come to him, and he's so loving. And I want you to get the full measure of this, right? Her confession, her kind of public nonverbal confession has a cost to it, right? This is what one commentator, Cole, says. For a woman to come out in public like that before an Asian crowd, and above all, to maybe possibly speak about what had happened to her, would be not only humbling for her, but it would be humbling for the crowd around her. Jesus crossed barriers. Women had no rights, and women had no place in the public sphere back then. But Jesus brings a woman into prominence, and he helps her cross those cultural barriers because everybody's equal at the foot of the cross. Everybody. Men, women, children, everybody. And Jesus wants that to be highlighted. And even though we don't deserve the Lord's help, her little bit of faith brought her that freedom. I love it. And finally, the third thing, Jesus gives hope to the hopeless, verse 35 through 43. Verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, okay, remember the sandwich technique. He's going to flip back to Jairus. Some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, and they said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? So what Mark's doing is he's highlighting what's going to happen. The miracle that's coming, he's building up to that, right? In the book of Mark, the first 8 chapters go like this. They build upwards towards a climax. It's like watching an Indiana Jones movie. How many of you like Indiana Jones? Or Star Wars or Star Trek? They kind of build like this, man, to a big place. And then it's boom, down like that afterwards, right? In the book of Mark, they build like this the first 8 chapters to the transfiguration. And then after that, it's downwards to the cross. And that's kind of how the book looks, right? And it doesn't look so great. But what he's doing here is he's doing the same kind of thing in a smaller manner. He's building up in the life of Jesus with Jairus, and then he takes a kind of downturn to this woman. And then what God does is great there. And then when he comes back, he throws another essence into the story. And that is that Jairus' daughter's dead. When we last left the story, she was alive and Jesus was going to make it. But Jesus stops to heal this woman, and now poor Jairus' daughter's dead. You can just hear all the Greek people reading this text at a church going, why would Jesus do that? Why would this happen? And the reason he does it is very simple. He's trying to build up for you to see just how wonderful and how powerful Jesus Christ is. And so then he goes on to say, while they were still speaking, right, verse 35, there's verse 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to him, do not be afraid, just believe. He comes back to the essence, which is to trust in him, right? Don't be afraid, just believe. Jairus had learned that his faith was more important than his fear, right? We'd seen that before. And now in verse 36, Jesus is trying to build him up. His buddies had come to him and kind of kicked the floor out from underneath him. You've been hanging out with Jesus, and now your daughter's dead. It's too late. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. Don't listen to what people say, even your close friends and confidants, the leaders. Just believe. Just have trust in me, right? It kind of reminds me that in our walk with Christ, when the ups and downs of life like that, just like Jairus, we need to be disciplined in our obedience. Do you know what I mean by that? It means that life's going to go like this, and it's going to go like this, and it's going to go like this, and it's going to go like this, it's going to go like this, and sometimes it's going to go all the way down here, and then back up. That's how life is on this broken world under the sun. Good and bad and everything in between, but we need to be disciplined in our faith of Jesus Christ. It's easy to follow Christ when we're here, right? On the high points, the mountains. It's harder to follow Christ when we're in the valleys. But that's what this story is all about. When we're in those valleys, like Jairus and the woman of the blood, we need to be desperate. We need to be humble and seek God's face. We need to pursue him and just believe and trust in him. That's what these stories are all about, to give us faith like that, right? This is what J.D. Jones says. The discipline of delay is hard to bear, right? Have you ever delayed on something? Child at Christmas time, you tell them you got to wait the night before Christmas? Can I just open one present? Oh, honey, you got to wait 8 more hours till Christmas morn. Really? Did you see that big present with my name on it? And yet you try to teach your children to wait, and most of us probably give them a bone and let them open a present or two, but the discipline of delay is difficult, right? How many of you put in for a job sometime, right? Put in for a job. Maybe you put in for 50. And you're like, somebody's going to throw me a bone and call me and give me a chance to work, right? A week goes by, 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by. Next thing you know, it's 6 weeks, 2 months, and you've not heard anything. And it's hard to be disciplined and have faith in God during those difficult times of waiting and to see that through. But often it's later on, somebody gives you a call and says, I just came across your resume, or I just came across whatever you posted on my website, and we want to give you an interview. But it's difficult. The discipline of delay is hard to bear. But the delay is not due to the fact that God grudges to bless us. It is because He has other and better blessings in store for us than that which we ask. I have been one of those people that have put in for a particular job that I wanted, and God said no to this one and this one and this one. And then the greater blessing came from a job I didn't even know about. That's how I got here. Was putting in for a few different churches that pursued me. And I said about this one, it was in the mountains. You know how I love the mountains. It was right in the peak of the mountains at 9,000 feet. And I thought, yes, Lord, you finally put me in the mountains. Thank you, Jesus. And I got down to the final 2 candidates, and I preached, and it went great. And I thought, this is a shoe and it's done. And then they called me and said they chose the other guy. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. Really, Jesus? Really? Come on. We've already planned where we're going to move and where we're going to live. And I'm already planning on being on this peak and all. And nothing was going on. And I said, we'll just take a break. Nobody's pursuing us. And then I got a call about this church in Delta, Colorado. And that's how we found out about you guys. And we're so glad that we didn't get the other church. But I'm still close enough to the mountains to get into it and do those things, right? But that discipline of delay, it's hard for us to stick with Jesus during that time. But we need to do what? Do not be afraid. Go on believing. Literally in the Greek it says not just believing, but literally in the Greek and Aramaic it means keep believing. Jairus was already believing. He had heard the bad news about his daughter's death. Jesus says, don't be afraid. Keep believing. Stick with me, Jesus. Stick with me, Jairus. See what's going to happen. So then he goes to kind of with his feelings, right? It looks bad, but Jesus has got this, right? Jesus has got this. And so he goes on and he says in verse 39, verse 38, verse 37, He did not let anyone follow him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Verse 38, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw the commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, with all this commotion and wailing, the child is not dead, but asleep. Now, can you imagine what everybody thought about during that time? This rabbi is crazy. We watched her die and breathe her last, and she's getting a little blue. And who's this Jesus saying that she's okay? She's not asleep, she's dead. And in verse 40, it says what they thought about that. They laughed at him, right? So not only did Jairus have this low point, but everybody around him is wailing, which would intensify those feelings. And he would just feel even worse, right? They laughed at him. But after he put them all out, Jesus had his friends put them all out. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him. He went into where the child was, verse 41. He took her by the hand and he said to her, in Aramaic is what it is, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Literally it means, my daughter, get up, right? And we've seen this before with the man who was lowered through the roof, what happens when Jesus does this work. Verse 42, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at that they were completely astonished. And he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Peter's kind of highlighting his remarks to Mark. And as Mark's recording this gospel account, Peter puts in, we know she was alive. Not only was she walking around and breathing, but she was taking food. She was eating a piece of fish or a piece of bread or whatever else, some grain or something. So we know that she was alive and well. Jesus is the God of the up, and he's the God of the down, and everything in between. And all he asks for us is that we trust him. And so as you look at the sandwich technique of Jairus here, the woman with the bleeding disorder, and then Jairus again, and they kind of went from this low point in the story back up to where the daughter's healed. When you put those things together, what Mark is trying to communicate to us in this whole area is this. And this is the big enchilada. If Jesus can raise a dead child from the dead, And if he can heal a chronically ill woman, he can do anything. He's already shown us that he can calm the storm, and in the future, in just the next couple of weeks, he's going to show that he can walk on water. And he can raise people from the dead, and he can heal the chronically ill. It'd be just the same as if he healed somebody who was terminally ill for 5 years with cancer and was on their deathbed, and Jesus went over and just said, "You're done." And then they were whole and pure, and everything was right. It's the same thing. In their culture, it's the same way as if we experience that in our culture. Mark is trying to highlight for us, Jesus is the Son of God. He's exactly who he says he is. He's Almighty God. And he can heal people, and he can calm the storm, and he can drive out demons, and he can raise people from the dead. And if this Jesus can do all those things, then you as the reader, what can he not do for you? That's what Mark's putting out there. Can you not trust this Jesus? All these people, the demoniac trusted Jesus, and legion of demons were kicked out of him, right? And then this woman trusts Jesus, and she's healed of her bleeding. And this man trusts Jesus, and his daughter's raised from the dead. And the disciples, who had a hard time trusting Jesus like the demoniac, but they have a little bit of faith, he calms the storm. If Jesus can do all those things, what can he do in your life? So that's the application I want you to think about as we close today. What problems, as we began the sermon, what problems are you dealing with today? What problems are heavy on your front burner? And what problems are heavy but a little bit less on your back burner? Usually, we often have problems on both burners, and sometimes we shift them, right, on what we have to deal with at the moment. This is something I got to deal with right now, so it's got to come on the front burner, and that's got to go to the back burner, take its place. How much of the time when we're shifting those problems and managing them and trying to deal with them, how much of the time are we driven to our knees and we beseech the God who spoke everything into existence and created everything, who did these miracles? How much of the time do we get on our knees and come to Jesus and say, "Lord, I need you to fix this issue. I need your power in my life today. I need you to take this issue and to do what you need to do with it, and whatever that is, I will accept that ad hoc. I'll just do it." How much of the time do we begin our problem management and dealing on our knees in humility like Jairus or like the bleeding woman, desperate for the cup of grace from Jesus? How much of the time do we believe that Jesus really can solve our marriage problems, our parenting problems with that wayward child? That Jesus really can solve our political problems as a nation? That Jesus really can solve issues like substance abuse, like suicide, like homicide? That Jesus can solve cultural issues like that? We need to believe these things because Mark is saying this God works in our world. He cares about each and every one of you, and he's willing to do something if we will just believe and trust him and bring our problems to the feet of Jesus. I think Mark's got a pretty strong message embedded in there for us today. So as we get ready to go into the time of invitation, I want you to think about what you're dealing with right now and what you need to bring to Jesus, what maybe you're holding on to, and what maybe you need to let go of, like Jairus and the bleeding woman. What you need to bring to him in prayer, what you need to put before him. And not only that, but just talk to God a little bit where you're at about the faith that you have. Whatever faith you bring to the table, he'll take, no matter how small. Because he's in the business of increasing our faith as he proves himself strong on our behalf. Let's pray.